This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin.
If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. All you have to do is scroll down to the bottom and click this big red button that says Patreon, and we're counting on you. Every week we bring you interviews with authors of books, research, or other things that we have found interesting. This episode is sponsored by the German government. Germany will be holding the EU presidency in the second half of 2020. And with their generous support, the Tel Aviv Review will be holding a series examining Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries.
And to do that, we have Hugh Lovatt on our show today. He's a policy fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations, where he focuses on EU policy towards the Middle East peace process, domestic Palestinian politics, and Israeli regional policy. Hugh has worked as a researcher for the International Crisis Group and as a Schuman Fellow in the European Parliament, focusing on Middle East policy. He holds an MA in Near and Middle Eastern Studies at the London School of Oriental and African Studies. He's the chairman of the Brussels-based European Middle East Project. In other words, he couldn't be better placed to answer our questions because he's written extensively at the ECFR, specifically about how European countries can strengthen the peace process, the issue of differentiation. He's conducted research on all of these topics, including a 2016 report we'll be discussing today called EU Differentiation and the Push for Peace in Israel-Palestine. Hugh, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Sure. Let's start with a broad, everything is a metaphor these days. We're going to take the temperature of EU-Israel relations. If you had to characterize how the EU feels right now about the Middle East peace process, you can speak on behalf of Brussels, individual governments, policy people. What's the one word you think best describes the temperature of those relations at the present?
Well, one word, that's a challenge.
Okay, you can use a few if you have to.
I would say probably lost or disorientated.
That's pretty succinct.
A bit of frustration.
Lost, disoriented, and frustration. Great. Explain, please.
So in terms of being lost and disorientated, I think it's very clear to both the critiques and supporters of the EU that it's wedded itself to this so-called two-state solution. This has been the central pillar of EU policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian peace conflict for at least the last 30 years, I would say. And I think, at the same time, a lot of, I think, analysts, including myself and others, are increasingly concerned that this two-state solution is either slipping or has slipped beyond grasp. And this new reality that I personally see emerging, sort of one could call it a one-state reality. Obviously that poses real challenges to Israelis and to Palestinians, but it also poses a real challenge to the EU. And I think it's lost at the moment because the current organizing paradigm, the current two-state paradigm that's been the main source of EU policy towards the conflict is now disappearing. But so far the EU has not yet been able to come up with a new set of policies that can better relate to the current reality. So that's kind of the lost and disorientated one.
But Hugh, the two-state solution has been the consensus pretty much internationally, not just among EU member states, but also other international players. Do you think that the EU is more affected by this disorientation and frustration than other international players?
To a certain extent. So clearly, the EU has become an enforcer of the status quo. Now one could argue whether the status quo has ever existed or not, but certainly, it's a lot of its policies have been geared towards propping up the Oslo configured Middle East peace process and the two-state solution. So that would be, I'd say, the first thing. And I say, secondly, of all the actors currently, both local and internationally, I would personally, maybe this is a bit provocative, but I'd personally say, besides the PLO, I would say it's the EU that is the most ardent and the truest believer in the two-state solution. If we look at the American administration at the moment, clearly it's somewhere else. I think if you look at other international actors, this is not to deny their own sense, the perhaps urgency or the how genuine they are when they look at the conflict. But I think certainly the two-state solution is less prominent in their own foreign policies, whether we look at China or Russia.
Not to mention Israel's government, such as it is.
Yeah, and the Israeli government is somewhere else. We can talk about that.
Right.
So I think for the EU, the two-state solution is something that it holds really, really to heart, and it has invested a lot of political and financial capital. So in that regard, I think it will be one of the most affected actors to a certain extent.
I just want to ask you, there's a quote that you had from your report back in 2016, which is 4 years ago, and it was you wrote, among many European policymakers, the belief still persists that the Middle East peace process in its current Oslo configuration offers the path to resolving the conflict. Failing that, they believe the peace process still represents an effective tool for managing the conflict, provided that both sides be coaxed back into talks. In light of what you just said, do you think that the EU policymakers still truly believe that, or are they kind of continuing at it out of a sort of inertia, precisely because they've invested so much in it that they just can't drop it now?
So it's been a few years since that report, and I think clearly in private, and now an increasing number of European officials are both in the EU and member states are acknowledging that the Oslo framework has broken down. And some will also acknowledge that two states is now perhaps no longer possible. But I think it's still a leap going from that to saying that publicly. Because if you say that publicly, then you admit that your current policies are no longer effective because you're now dealing with another reality. And then therefore you need to put in place a new set of policies to deal with that new post-two-state reality. And that's to be fair, that's difficult for any actor. It is a complex situation which we're moving into. But for the EU, there's the added complication, which is it has to manage its own internal divisions.
But Hugh, it seems to me like they haven't been, barking up the tree incessantly with, differing degrees of enthusiasm, because the differentiation policy that you describe in your work is a way of maybe taking a more proactive approach towards that impasse. Let
me give a little background for that comment. You wrote, and you did not mince words, that you thought the EU should be less passive and take more initiative on this, and that's how we get to the differentiation policy.
But the differentiation policy, which we'll ask you to explain in a second, is a way of maybe taking a more proactive and less passive.
Yeah. So we both asked half the question. Did you get it?
Exactly. Yeah. Over to you.
Yes. So again, I always have to caveat this. I mean, what I'm going to say is obviously if we still believe we're in a reality in which two states can still be achieved, maybe it's not currently achievable, but that still, remains a distant prospect. And I think, if we're talking about that reality, then certainly my argument would be that, that there is currently a massive gap between EU rhetoric and EU actions. And so in terms of rhetoric, I think the EU has been very good in terms of its policies on paper. I very little to fault it with in that regard.
Wait, sorry, just spell that out. You mean the rhetoric has been very good? Sorry, just spell that out for our listeners. You mean the rhetoric has been very good in terms of? Yeah. In terms of?
In terms of its positions towards a two-state solution, in terms of how it envisages, the final status parameters, how it envisages the resolution of the conflict, its adherence on paper to international law, these sorts of things. I think that's great. Its support for Palestinian self-determination, equal rights, increasingly, which is emerging in some of its statements. But what I'm saying is the gap is that it has, over years, been very reluctant to translate those positions on paper into actual concrete actions. So, the EU, I mean, this is going off on a slight tangent, but, the EU has invested millions of euros into Palestinian state building. And one could say that that's been effective in terms of, having the IMF and the World Bank and others declaring Palestinian institutions to be statehood ready. This was years ago that we had those declarations. But then the EU always shied away from making the next logical step, which would be to recognize Palestine. That's one example. Another one is it's been very critical of the settlements, but it has done very little concretely to manifest that opposition. So many member states continue to oppose or be very lukewarm towards the UN database of businesses with links to Israeli settlements. At the same time, while the EU has made clear progress in this idea of differentiating between Israel and the settlements at the level of its bilateral relations, member states have been are very far behind the curve in that regard, and often quite reluctant to formally exclude the settlements from their relations, or go out of their way to try not to be in a position where they have to do that. So I think this is kind of what I'm saying is you have positions on paper that, to me, when it comes to the settlements and the two-state solution, I think are perfectly good, but the EU has shied away and been very reluctant to actually doing anything that can lock in those positions.
What would those things be?
So it depends. So as I said, if one looks at the settlements, and if one takes the position that settlements are a major obstacle to achieving a two-state solution, of course not the only one, but manifestly are a critical issue, then I think the question is, what should the EU be doing to actually more concretely oppose those settlements, and to actually also highlight to Israelis that the settlements are an issue, not just in terms of preventing a two-state solution, but also harming Israel's relations with the outside world. And so, and that's going back to this idea of differentiation, that the EU and its member states, have a duty in terms of international law, their own domestic positions, and also foreign policy positions to exclude those settlements from their bilateral relations with Israel, to make sure that their relations with Israel stop at the 1967 Green Line.
Okay, so that's your basic way of saying, okay, here's how to close the gap between the rhetoric that is in the right direction and the policy which hasn't really kept up. You're kind of saying differentiation is the way to bridge that gap and make the policy concrete. Is that correct?
Exactly. I mean, and let's be fair, it's not a silver bullet, and it's not the only thing that should be done. But I think if you're looking purely at policy towards the settlements, then that would seem to be a natural conclusion to draw.
Okay, so tell us some of the forms that it takes. Is it like boycott? I'm just trying to, ask you the kinds of questions that, that Israeli society has on their mind when they hear about this stuff.
Sanctions rather than boycott.
Sanctions, boycott. What is it?
Yeah. And so certainly, we've seen a lot of what I would call, disinformation or misinformation from the Israeli government and supporters of the settlements that have labeled this EU differentiation as a variety of things, from being anti-Semitic, akin to economic terrorism, to BDS and other things. There's obviously a lot to unpack, but I think the starting point is to acknowledge that what the EU is doing, this is very much at what I would call the interstate level, so at the level of state to state or EU to Israel level relations. And it's premised on sort of legal necessity, by virtue of the EU's own rules and regulations, domestic positions, and also international law, which sort of requires the non-recognition of Israeli settlements and prohibits third states from facilitating unlawful actions such as the settlements. Based on these legal considerations, third states, in this case the EU and EU member states, have an obligation to ensure that their relations with Israel, which are legitimate, that these relations exclude the settlements. And we've seen, and sometimes this actually requires Israel to accommodate these legal requirements. And so in some instances, we have seen Israeli governments accommodate these positions and enforcing their own sort of internal differentiation, in sectors to do with poultry and dairy products and even research and innovation projects.
How does that manifest itself? How do those examples play out when you say in poultry and innovation, where show us the examples where Israel itself abides by that differentiation?
So this becomes like a very geeky thing, and so
make it ungeeky for us. You can cook the chicken in a great recipe. Just kidding.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's important to understand, because we have the impression that Israel completely rejects this idea of differentiation.
Mm-hmm. So something like with poultry, for example, it basically requires Israel to set up 2 different production lines, and then to ensure that poultry, so chickens that are reared in the settlements, stay within Israel or don't make their way to EU markets, and that poultry products that come from within what we recognize as Israel within the 67 borders, those products are most welcome in the EU. So that's kind of a very sort of technical manifestation, but
you're saying Israel actually does that already.
Yeah.
So in other words, Israel's doubling its work, creating a big bureaucratic headache for itself, and not even making it very public.
Because also I think the issue of poultry products is, not perhaps the most sexy issue, and also,
depends who you ask.
Gilad, had something you want to tell us?
but obviously it impacts only a small sector of Israeli, of Israel's economy. However, I think something where there has been much more of a notice, and everyone always talks about this, I think quite rightly, is the issue of Horizon 2020. So Horizon 2020 is an EU research and development innovation project. And so what we saw was when this project was launched, the EU put down clear funding guidelines. And one of these funding guidelines said that only Israeli entities within the 1967 borders would be eligible to access the project and the associated funding. Now, initially, the Israeli government refused that because it would not, on ideological grounds, differentiate between entities in Israel or those in the settlements. And it risked losing out on this project for the sake of ideology. But then what we saw in response is a lot of the academic institutions and research institutions in Israel pressuring the Israeli government to acquiesce to the EU's conditions. And ultimately, the Israeli government did. And so I think the broader, idea is that the EU that if the EU holds to its legally necessitated line, it forces the Israeli government or Israeli authorities to have to choose between their ideological support for the settlements or their external relations with the EU. And it basically underscores that you can't, be expanding a settlement project that the EU doesn't recognize while at the same time deepening your relations with the EU.
But Hugh, the question is how gravely the external relations with the EU and perhaps other countries and international organizations have been affected. Because at the end of the day, as Dalia said, Israel is doubling up a lot of work and, bending over backwards to make it work. But if you look at the broader scheme of things, the industry in the settlements makes up a rather negligible part of the broader Israeli economy. Mm-hmm. And, it might be just a flesh wound for Israel and, a price they're willing to pay to maintain a very good relationship with everything else in Israel proper.
Yeah. So before getting to the full answer, I would say that I don't think Israel is bending over backwards. Obviously it's done the poultry and a few other things, but by and large,
just bending a few chickens.
By and large, I think it's the EU that's actually bending over backwards to avoid putting Israel in such a position. And there's a whole issue about the extent to which Israeli settlement products access preferential trade tariffs in the EU, which has been a long and ongoing discussion, and there's been problems with that.
Do they have preferential trade status?
So in theory, not. But the problem is the enforcement of that rests on European authorities, on the EU border and customs authorities, not on the Israeli exporter. And so that creates additional complications. So I'd say that as an example to which, I think it's more the EU that has kind of gone out of its way to try to not make this a big issue.
In other words, sometimes the goods do enjoy preferential trade status coming from the settlements?
So there are instances in which they have accessed this because the certificates of origins have been incorrectly filled out. And so instead of saying, product of Israeli settlement, it says product of Israel. And the problem is the border authorities are not able to control every single product.
So in other words, in answer to Gilad, to our earlier question, not only is this not a boycott or sanctions, but products are not only getting sold, but they're getting preferential trade status sometimes.
In some instances, right, that has been documented. Yes,
and certainly this doesn't affect trade from Israel proper. So It'd be a little bit hard to talk about this as a BDS of any kind, right?
Well, exactly. And I think, and before getting to also to Gilad a question which I've been avoiding so far, but I think it's also
you're not the first to do that.
I will get there. But there was a lot of controversy over this, this EU requirements for the correct labeling of settlement products. And
just tell us what labeling really is, so clearly for our listeners.
So it's purely the correct labeling of settlement products. So Israeli products always had to be labeled, or Israeli food products, I should say, have always had to be labeled like food products in any other country. The problem was, up to a certain point, these products that were from Israeli settlements were being labeled as products of Israel. And there was a feeling that this was incorrect from the point of view of supplying correct consumer information to EU citizens. And so the Commission issued some clarifications saying that products from the Israeli settlements should be labeled as coming from Israeli settlements. And this created a big backlash amongst, from the Israeli government, even, members of the Israeli Labour Party opposition at the time, and elsewhere, accusations of anti-Semitism. But the point I want to make is, when you look at it, these products are still being sold in the EU. So this was never about banning settlement products. It was just about purely ensuring that the labeling was correct. And in many ways, this was kind of an attempt to avoid having to ban the products. So in other words, it was probably, one could almost argue, it allowed the settlement products to continue being sold in EU markets. So despite the Gewalt that came from the Israeli authorities, actually the consequence of this labeling was perhaps much more normative. So in terms of the EU continue to make a distinction rather than an actual cost, imposing an actual cost on Israel. So this is the answer to Gilad is, differentiation is not about inflicting harm on Israel, like economic harm.
No, applying pressure, not so much inflicting harm.
So I think we need to. So, but often that's how it's portrayed. And so when people say, "Oh, this is sanctions," it's not, because sanctions are coercive to a certain extent. Are coercive and are designed to inflict pain. This is not. This is a normative thing. Now, I think where it does have leverage is through this normative angle. So again, it's about the EU continuing to say that we continue to make a difference between Israel and the settlements, or Israel and the occupied territories, and it's pushing back against what has been quite a concerted effort by the supporters of the Israeli settlement movement to erase this distinction between Israel and the occupied territories on the ground, but now increasingly internationally. But one final point I want to make on that is, at the moment we've seen differentiation applied. It's been very piecemeal. So at the level of EU-Israel relations, it's more and more of these agreements have been corrected. But as I said, elsewhere it's very ad hoc. But we haven't yet, with the exception of Horizon 2020, this research project, we haven't yet really seen differentiation affecting areas of the EU-Israel relationship that are considered to be very vital.
What are those areas that are very vital?
So the big one that's been mentioned would be, the financial sector. If the EU started to say, listen, we can only trade with the bit of Israel's financial sector that remains within the Green Line, and that, and we can't expose our financial dealings with that sector to the settlement, to the Israeli financial institutions in the settlements. If it started trying to impose a differentiation between this, I think that's when it would become quite potent, because everyone knows there is no distinction between.
Right. I mean, how can you deal with an Israeli bank if that Israeli bank is, based inside the Green Line, but also funds mortgages for settlements outside the Green Line?
Well, exactly. And so I think this is when it becomes very much more impactful. And, we've seen instances, in terms of these financial considerations when it comes to, financial dealings with Iran. And of course, not comparing Israel to Iran, of course. But we have seen, in terms of when certain third states have concern that their financial relations could be supporting what they consider to be an unlawful project, we have seen them take measures. so my point with Israel is, if you saw this differentiation applied to the financial sector, it would create obviously massive waves, and I think it would put the financial sector in an area where you'd either have to ring fence its own operations, basically creating two separate entities, which we all know would almost be impossible.
And why has the EU not gone there? Why are we not seeing that?
Well, because it's an extremely controversial thing even for me to be saying. I mean, because of the impact it would have on the financial linkages between the EU and Israel, and so the EU has gone out of its way to say this is not something it would ever consider doing.
I wonder also to what extent Israel, this inability to, be more forceful it derives from Israel's efforts to drive a wedge between certain EU countries and perhaps recruit more, quote unquote, friendly governments like Hungary and Poland and Slovakia to frustrate such steps.
Yeah, I mean, Israel has its own differentiation policy, which is differentiation from, France, Germany, and other Western European countries who might be unified or a little more unified over this kind of thing. Maybe we should leave Germany out of that. And other EU countries that don't seem to mind as much. That's Israel's differentiation policy. How does that work?
So I think one has to give credit to the Israeli government. I think it's been very effective.
Totally, lots of credit.
Yeah, absolutely, in playing the EU's game, and in some ways better than most member states in terms of engaging with some member states to block some other member states and to block EU level action. And we've seen Netanyahu's repeated visits and meetings with members or leaders from the Visegrad countries, so the Central European or Central and Eastern European countries of the EU, and we've seen that also that kind of attempt to to enlist that bloc, but now also other blocs, whether it's the Baltics or some of the Balkan countries that could be future members as well. So it's proved extremely effective. But I think there's another element which is also, and we can't really downplay this, it's the extent to which Israel's reaction to something which I think is, as I said before, very inconsequential almost, which is the labeling, which, besides the normative issue, as I said, labeling has very little impact. But the ferocious nature of Israel's response to this labeling, the browbeating, the arm twisting, the besmirching of the EU's character, the EU really felt that. And I think, when we talk about, Israeli military strategy, there's this doctrine about a sort of a disproportionate response to any provocation. That Israel always deployed 10 times more force against the adversary. And I think you could see this in some way in terms of its diplomatic relations with the EU. So something as inconsequential as labeling elicits a ferocious reply from Israel. And I think that's had an impact, because I think you have the EU and a lot of member states that go, oh my God, we never want to go there again.
Right. Let me represent one of those critical questions that is often heard in Israel from many people, including from our previous interviewee, Maya Sion, an Israeli academic. And she, observed that this differentiation policy is really different from any other policy the EU holds for other near member states, so people within the first or states within the first orbit of non-EU members. She claims there is no other state that the EU relates to in that way, and that certainly does make it look like an outstanding kind of singling out of Israel. So, which is true?
So yes, that's an interesting point. And this goes back to this question about whether this is sanctions or not. And as I said, obviously differentiation is not a sanction. But then let's look at what the EU has done in other situations that are somewhat comparable. So let's look at Crimea, which was, as we all know, annexed by Russia. In that case, you could look at that measures the EU took, and some of them one could fit within the differentiation category. So, but even in this instance, much more harder than what it's done vis-a-vis Israel. So, for example, prohibiting the import of products from Crimea unless they have certificates of origin from Kyiv, which of course is not going to happen. It hasn't done that in Israel. So the equivalent would be to say, the EU will only accept products from the Israeli settlements if they have a certificate of origin issued by the PA. So it hasn't done that. But then in the case of Crimea, it's gone even further, and it's in that case actually has imposed, what it would call restrictive measures, but commonly known as sanctions.
Crippling sanctions, we should say, or at least they were intended to be crippling.
Well, I mean, they're targeted against, individuals, entities that were perceived to have been supportive of and driving Russia's annexation of Crimea. So again, those things we haven't seen in the case of the occupation of the West Bank. I could go on. Look,
I think we have to talk about one more. Yeah, Northern Cyprus, exactly. And our favorite, everybody's favorite, Western Sahara. Please tell us about both and why they are similar or different.
Yeah, and so again, Northern Cyprus, there's a lot of, each situation is different in many ways. Northern Cyprus is EU territory, Northern Cypriots are by and large considered EU citizens, et cetera, et cetera. But in this case with Northern Cyprus, again, products from Northern Cyprus are only allowed into EU markets if they have a certificate of origin issued by Nicosia. Again, so this is something we haven't done vis-a-vis Israeli settlement products.
In other words, you could say that the EU is relating to Turkey the same way it's relating to Israel in refusing to accept products that Turkey would say, they shouldn't be labeled as made in Cyprus.
Well, so that's labeling is slightly different. And this gets very, very, very complicated. But basically, It's a bit of a moot point because any product that comes from Northern Cyprus will only be allowed into the EU market with the acceptance of the Cypriot authorities of Nicosia. So it's Nicosia that sets the rules in terms of how it wants to relate to these products. I'm sort of oversimplifying, but that's the general gist.
Okay.
Which is, so again, slightly different. With Western Sahara, for sure, and I think, I won't mince my words. I think the way that some member states and the European Commission has behaved towards Western Sahara is, in my view, verging on shameful in terms of also bending its rules. And so when you do have supporters of the Israeli settlements that attack the EU for not enforcing similar standards in West Sahara, I think to a certain extent they're right. Now, again, there's some differences in terms of how the EU sees the territory from its own legal point of view. But no, I think certainly the EU deserves criticism for how it's engaged with Western Sahara. Having said that, I think what Western Sahara does show is that there is a certain inevitability when it comes to the implementation of EU rules. So even when we have states that don't want to fully respect them, and also, by the way, with regards to the settlements, the EU and member states haven't really warm-heartedly embraced their legal necessity either. And often it's what they do is a product of prodding and pushing by civil society, by other member states, by parliamentarians. So this is not, I don't think we should over-exaggerate how eager the EU has been towards the settlements. Having said that, certainly towards Western Sahara, it hasn't done enough, in my view, to meet its legal requirements. Mm-hmm. But then what happens is, what's happened is the Polisario has taken a case against the European Council.
Right, to the European Court of Justice? Yeah,
to the European Court of Justice, saying basically that the EU is not differentiating between Western Sahara and Morocco in its bilateral agreements to do with agriculture and fisheries. And each time the European Court of Justice says, you're right, the EU should do more to implement its non-recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara and to ensure that its agreements with Western Sahara do not that its agreements with Morocco do not include Western Sahara. The Council has been fighting this. So again, that goes back to my criticism of it. Right. But it does show that the EU remains a rules-based organization. So even sometimes when it doesn't want to meet its own rules, whether that's its rules towards the settlements or its rules towards Western Sahara, we do see that, again, that this law does have a certain inevitability. It's just a matter of whether the EU is sort of dragged kicking and screaming.
Okay. Let's look at the ultimate question about all this, which is how effective is it? I want to point out that on the website of the European Council on Foreign Relations, you have a tracker page in which you go through each member state, bless you, and each member state's different agreements on tax agreements, trade issues, and, rather technical things. But you look at each one and whether they comply with UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which is basically making this distinction between settlements and Israel. And I see, and you have this column where you mark with an X or a V or a check mark whether these agreements with the member states are complying. And I see a lot of red X's there, meaning in so many agreements they're not complying, including the kinds of countries you'd think would comply, like even Norway was all X's. Denmark had one agreement in compliance. So is this, whether, beyond the justification, is this strategy effective?
Is the differentiation strategy effective? So the answer is, at the moment, I don't think it is. I mean, I think one has to be quite frank, and it pains me to say this as someone who's been really pushing this, but I think it's clear that development on the ground, in particular, what I would call Israel's creeping annexation, de facto annexation, settlement building, continues to outpace any positive dynamics that can be achieved through differentiation, and especially as we talked about the normative effect that differentiation can have. Now, I don't think there's been no impact of this strategy. Again, when it comes to this normative idea, I think differentiation has been important in terms of allowing the EU and its member states to continue to say there is a difference between Israel and the settlements, and we do not recognize Israeli sovereignty over the settlements, which flies in the face of what the settler movement wants, what the Israeli government wants, and what the American administration also seems to want, because the American administration has also been kind of attacking this idea of differentiation. So I think it would be wrong to say that differentiation has achieved nothing, but certainly it hasn't achieved enough. And I think, as the differentiation tracker shows, is because quite clearly, besides some noteworthy achievements that we've talked about, I would say the vast majority of Europe's relation with Israel continues to include the Israeli settlements, and I think it's still, saying this, EU is by far one of the best pupils in the class when it comes to differentiation. I mean, if you look at outside of Europe, and again, all third states have this same obligation. The US has some examples of differentiation dating from the 1980s. But then there's very few other countries that have reciprocated. Like, Russia, to my knowledge, has done nothing. China has, in one of its labor agreements with Israel, made a distinction.
And South Korea, right?
And South Korea and its free trade agreement. So, there are some instances, but by and large, most member states have done nothing. Canada's done nothing. Australia's done nothing. So it'd be wrong to say this is an EU-centric problem. But I think, and going back to also Gilad's question a bit earlier on about, what impact it can have. And I mentioned the finance stuff, which is quite an abstract term because it's the world of finances is very complicated, and I hardly understand my own taxes. But if one wants a practical example of this idea of, applying differentiation to the financial sphere, look at the fact that most third states, or certainly most third states in Europe, have an agreement with Israel on the avoidance of double taxation, which means that if you live in one country, you're not going to, and you declare your taxes to that country, but you're a citizen of the other, then you don't get taxed twice. Now, most of these taxation agreements, don't clearly differentiate between Israel and the settlements. And so there is a big risk, and I know in some cases this actually has happened, where where settlers can claim the benefits of those provisions of the bilateral taxation agreement.
Well, as someone who is robustly double taxed by the U.S. and Israel, I can tell you that if people in the settlements had to pay double taxes, they would hightail it out of there.
And I think that's exactly. I think this is the issue also, in terms of the broader theory of change. And again, I want to stress that this is not just. The issue is not just settlements. The issue is not just Israel. We could have another conversation about Palestine and Palestinians.
I did have a question on that, because you do write about that too, that the Palestinian situation also requires a lot of change in order for there to be a peace process.
But on the Israeli stuff, just like in terms of the broader theory of changes, again, it's not the EU that's going to end the occupation. It's ultimately going to have to be a decision that's taken by Israeli society. And as an outside observer, I think that the problem I see at the moment is that the cost-benefit calculations that most Israelis have lean predominantly towards continuing the occupation. And I can't blame Israelis because, what you have with occupation. It seems like it's worked okay for the last 50 plus years. why would you move towards an uncertain and unknown reality of ending the occupation with all the uncertainties that that brings? Especially if at the current moment you don't feel like you're actually paying any cost for it. Now, of course, I would say long term it's going to be big issues in terms of demographics and et cetera, et cetera. But certainly at the moment, Israelis to say, well, where's the cost? And so I think the differentiation is kind of a way to also chip away at that cost benefit calculation.
Yeah.
So if you're going after chickens, just to finish, then obviously someone who lives in Tel Aviv doesn't care if a poultry farmer in the settlements can or cannot export his chicken products to the EU.
To Denmark.
But I think if it starts chipping away at something else, which is like the financial sphere, then I think average Israelis do start to feel the pinch.
Do you think, and let me ask you this last question before we wrap up, do you think there's any sort of reckoning among EU policymakers that, it needs to be done, that they need to turn up the heat for, to save their dearly beloved two-state solution, if it can be saved at all?
I think there's certainly acknowledgement that the two-state solution is moving increasingly beyond reach. And there's a lot of concern about potential moves by the next Israeli government to de jure to formally annex West Bank territory. And, and this feeling that perhaps something should be done. But I think, again, I think the negative trajectory on the ground is likely to outpace any action that could come from the EU. So by the time the EU may decide to do something, it risks reacting to a fait accompli rather than actually preempting it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on that cheerful note, Hugh Lovatt, thank you for coming to the show. You should say you're speaking to us from London, so thanks again for being here. And it's good to talk to you.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed it.
And thanks to Itai Shelem and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, and again to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. Thank you especially to the German government for sponsoring this special series on Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like you to please consider writing us a review. Just go to the ratings and review section and write us whatever you think and feel. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing to our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have over 500 interviews. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel, and follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.